it takes a lot to have a strong foundation in your marriage. And when you've got the added stress of, having a startup is a lot like having a child. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of focus. When the baby cries, you have to handle it. And when the startup cries, you can't really just put it aside for a couple weeks until it feels like a good time, or you'll never get where you're trying to get.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Journey. I am your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups to 7- and 8-figure companies, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where we help startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. And on today's journey, we have a bit of a different journey to talk through, a bit of a different episode. So typically we go through the journey that's different founders and co-founders or go through as they do startups and small businesses. But today we're going to switch topics just a little bit and have a special episode with Jen Schwartz, and I'll let her introduce herself in just a minute. But we thought one thing that a lot of startups and small businesses often face is, you have a lot of time and effort into getting into a startup. You have to put in, whether it's time in the office and thought process and being engaged, or having your mind somewhere else, as well as putting in money and just doing all of those things in order to get a startup going. And it can be sometimes a strain on a marriage, or it can be difficult to keep a strong marriage. And so this episode with Jen, she's a marriage and family therapist. We're going to talk through a few ideas and ways and things to think about in order to keep a strong marriage as you're trying to go through and do your startup and make your business successful and put in all of your time and effort, making sure your marriage doesn't fall apart, your family still sees you, your wife still loves you, and your kids are still there. So with that introduction, welcome onto the podcast, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I gave a very brief overview of yourself, but maybe tell everybody a little bit about yourself, what your practice, what you do, and then we'll kind of dive into a bit more on how to keep a strong marriage.
Sure. So as you said, my name's Jen Schwartz. I have a doctorate in transformational psychology, and I'm also a certified family life educator. So I work a lot with couples and families. I also work with adults and children and teens in a lot of different capacities. But one of the reasons I love this conversation in particular is because I have experience on both sides of it. So I've started several businesses. I've also been the spouse of people starting businesses. And I've got, of course, all my breadth of knowledge on just families and relationships in general, and how to create strong marriages and keep them that way. So I can kind of speak from both sides of it. Well, actually, I just said three sides, right? I can speak from all three sides of it. I know what it's like to be the widow of the business at home and feel like your spouse is out all the time. And I know what it's like to be that person who's out there doing the drive and taking the time and energy outside of the house as well.
Okay.
And, in my practice, we focus on a lot of different things, but I definitely have clients where this kind of dynamic is an issue. And so I've got some experience working with clients where they've got entrepreneurs in the family, either spouse. It's not always the husband's, although it does tend to be for the most part, but sometimes it's the wife who's out starting a new business and doing a new thing. And it does take something, and it takes something to have a strong marriage, period. It doesn't matter. Even if you just have both regular 40-hour-a-week jobs, or one person does and one's at home, it takes a lot to have a strong foundation in your marriage. And when you've got the added stress of, having a startup is a lot like having a child. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of focus. When the baby cries, you have to handle it. And when the startup cries, you can't really just put it aside for a couple weeks until it feels like a good time, or you'll never get where you're trying to get. So there's a lot of parallels to family life in business startup life as well.
No, I think that, first of all, I think that it certainly is helpful to have someone that's both been through it themselves, as well as have spouses and otherwise. And I think that, to your point, I agree. I think that a good and strong marriage takes a lot of work no matter what. And even before I got into a lot of startups and that I've done, and was working more of a 9-to-5 job, it still takes a lot of work. And then putting on that added stress, an employee calls you at 7 or 8 or, something else and says that they're sick for the next day or that they can't do something or that they have a question, it's hard to, kind of adds that added layer of stress, not to mention sometimes even when you're at home, your mind tends to wander back to the issues that are at the office or the things you have to get done the next day. So I think that adds that. So I have a few questions, but maybe before I jump into my questions, what would be the number one thing or the thing if you were to pick? And I know it's hard to pick one thing because it's not just a quick solution.
Right.
But if you're saying, hey, somebody that's just getting into a startup or small business is just getting going, what would be the one thing that you'd want them to consider or think about in order to keep their marriage strong?
Well, I think probably the fundamental thing is looking at what are the agreements of your marriage. And when I say that, when I work with couples in particular, that's one of the first questions I always ask them. What agreements do you have in your marriage? And mostly people look at me first like I have 3 heads when I say that, because most couples haven't had a conversation about that. Most couples don't have a set of agreements that they've sat down, talked about, compromised on, agreed upon, have it written down, and it's like a contract in their relationship. Now, there's those understood agreements we all have, right? If you get married, there's some agreements like, I'm not going to just move to France without you. We don't have to talk about that. That's understood, right? I'm not going to go start another relationship because I'm married to you. Doing that obviously is outside the bounds.
Nope. Did we lose you? Hello? Uh-oh.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. I was going to go see if I had to restart something. That's weird. So
yeah, have no idea what happened. I looked and everything seemed to be okay, but it just launched itself back up. Okay.
All right. So we're back. We'll back up, rewind.
Yes.
So we're talking about looking at three-headed, having the relationship and what the agreements are near in place. And then for some reason it went slightly haywire. So let's rewind back to that and we'll go through that one more time.
Sure. So what I was saying is, most couples don't have spoken or written agreements like a contract in their relationship. And I always find it interesting because when I get couples talking about, well, okay, what do you think your agreements are? They're very rarely saying the same thing. So, there are some things, and, we sort of default to things, right? Like when my children were very young, I had said I wanted to stay home with them. And so we defaulted to this world of my husband's out making money and I'm at home with children. And in general, that worked really well for us. It wouldn't work well for everyone, but for us it did. But inside that, there were a lot of things that we didn't talk about, like how much time was he then going to spend at home with me and the children? Right? What was I agreeing to do? I was agreeing to take care of children. That was what I was doing, but I wasn't necessarily agreeing to also take care of the house and the yard and the dog and the whole list of everything else that there is at life, just because my husband was out making money. So, when people start talking about what those agreements are, it's a long process of getting really clear, or it can be a long process of getting clear. What are we really promising to each other? And, there can be really basic fundamental promises like, I promise to bring home at least X amount of dollars every month. And, I promise to make sure there's food in the house, but it goes beyond those things. When my husband and I first got together, we both had children from our previous marriage. And one of our early agreements in our relationship was that we both promised to be kind to one another's children. And like on the one hand, why would you have to talk about that and write it down? That's like basic human decency, that we're going to be kind to each other's children, right? But we found that, and this is just, true of families, blending families takes a lot of work. And so having some lengthy conversations about, when I say be kind, here's what I mean. and then promising that that's how we would interact with each other's children. That was a really important agreement for us to have. Now, we've been together for 11 years. We have a 7-year-old son together, as well as all of our children, 4 of whom are adults now. And that's not on our list of agreements anymore, because it's so fundamental to who we are. And our family we put a lot of work into blending our family in a really powerful way, that we don't have to have that there anymore as something that we talk about and need to focus on. So, but we do have a promise that says that we will parent with love and compassion. So you can see it's very much the same in certain ways, and yet it's evolved over time. So get back to the very basic part of the question. You have to have agreements in your relationship, just like any business contract you would have. A great tool for doing that, by the way, there's a book called 8 Dates by the Gottmans. The Gottmans are like the gurus of marriage and relationship in the world, if you haven't heard of them. And they actually have capacity to predict. They can spend about 2 to 3 hours with you, and they can predict out of those 2 to 3 hours within 90% accuracy if you'll still be married in 5 years. It's that's how much work they've done with marriages. And in their book, 8 Dates, what they do is they walk through 8 conversations where you sit down with each other and you ask these questions and talk about things that most couples never talk about. One of the dates is about money, right? Which relates directly to business. And it's questions like, what does it mean to us to have enough? What are our goals around money? How do we intend to make that money? And also digging into the past. How did you grow up? Because if you grew up where, daddy went to work and made a ton of money and you never had to think about things, your relationship to money and business is very different than if you grew up like I did with a single mom who worked 2 and 3 jobs at a time.
So maybe on that, jumping to that kind of that question. So if you're talking about money, because, that's oftentimes a difficult thing with startups, right?
Yes.
At least it's an issue, right? So a lot of times if you want to do a startup, one thing is you're having to bootstrap, right? Or you may be dipping savings in order to get things going with the hope or anticipation that things will pick up. Or, you go and get a credit card and max. And I'm not saying all these are good ideas, but this certainly happens.
But they happen, yes.
So how do you deal with that if you're wanting to get a startup or going and you're saying, hey, we may take a dip in income, or should we dip into our savings, or should we go and take out a debt, which, second mortgage on the home? Or how do you approach that with a spouse? And I'm sure it's different depending on, your spouse, but how do you bring that up, or how do you deal with that? Because I can certainly see if you're saying, hey, we've got, and I'm just making them, or $300,000 saved, and now I'm going to go spend $150,000 to chase my dream and get a startup. The other spouses, and you mentioned kind of generally women versus men. A lot of times it seems like women want the financial security that, that you have some savings, you have some money set aside for rainy day. So how do you make that balance or deal with that issue?
Yeah. Well, you really said it already, which is that it's really going to depend on the people involved, right? Everybody's got different experiences around that. But I think so much of it is just about communicating. If it is, the example you used, right? I want to use half of our savings to go do this thing. Well, if you're using half of the savings, that means half of it's still there. So you're not saying I want to take the whole 300,000 and leave us with nothing, right? So you're coming to the table with an idea that kind of helps both sides. It gives you the opportunity to go and take this risk and make this dream happen, but it also still leaves some security there and some stability. And then the really important thing is if you get to an agreement with that, and maybe the agreement is, okay, I don't feel with a half, but why don't you take a third? Take a third of it. Take just 100,000 and leave 200,000 in that account, right? So you get to that compromise, and then what often happens with startups is you blow through that $100,000 and you're not there yet, and you need more, right?
Yeah, you anticipated my next question, so that's what I was going to ask.
Right, exactly. So then when you get to that point, or close, hopefully before you get to that point, right? It's what it takes is another conversation and willingness on both parts to do some compromising, but also to not overstep the comfort level of the person who wants the security. Because I think that's a really good way to erode some foundation really fast, right? So if I'm the one who needs that financial stability, and in my relationship, I am that person. And as you said, it typically is, women typically want that more, and men tend to be more of the risk takers. If I don't have that, it's not just like eroding a foundation. It really is like my whole world gets rocked, right? And if my whole world's rocked, I can't then support my husband because I don't have it. I don't have the energy left. I don't have the space left to support him if I don't feel like I have that stability that I need. So, I think a good thing to do then in the beginning is to say, okay, whatever we've compromised on is this. What's the backup plan if it's not enough? Right? And part of the backup plan has to be that we'll communicate about it at that point. Unfortunately, what I've seen happen many times, and my ex-husband was guilty of this, not to call him out, I won't say his name, but is to get to that point and then go, okay, well, I'll just do this thing over here and I won't mention it. And hopefully it'll all turn out all right. And, even if it does turn out all right, even if you come back later and you're like, look, remember that $100,000 agreement we had? Well, I went and took a $50,000 line of credit because it wasn't enough, and it's all fine. I've paid it back and we're in good shape. Even then, you've got this huge lie that was present in your relationship for however long of time that was. And that's not good for marriages either. So I think so much of it is being upfront, being clear, and having the tough conversations. And they can be really hard to have. And sometimes the best thing to do is to have someone else there with you, whether that's a counselor, a therapist, a mediator, or just a good friend who's not really, not bought into the business, right? Not your business partner, because then you've got your spouse feeling ganged up on, and not your parents or their parents, but somebody who's really neutral, who can be there and listen and help things be heard.
Yeah, and it's kind of online, and I think that's great thoughts and advice. If you do, because I can imagine, and I'm usually on the side of more of the risk. Although I'm financially pretty conservative, I don't like to do anything on debt or dive into anything, so I kind of straddle. But on the risk gauge, I'm probably at least wanting to do startups and wanting to take on those challenges. But I could see that a spouse, so let's say you have these conversations, right, and you get through the 100,000, and 100,000 is not enough. Startups typically take longer; they take more money. You didn't.
Right.
Things come up, and so you're saying, hey, I thought I could get it done for this, but I can't, and you do that. Then the spouse doesn't want you to give up on your dreams, or doesn't want to be the bad guy, or doesn't want that. So sometimes they'll, even if they're not fully on board, they'll act the supportive role, right? Or they'll say, okay, let's do this, or that makes sense, or that. So how do you not just how do you deal with the actual issue of, hey, I'm not comfortable, I don't want to dive further into our savings and that, and yet be the supportive spouse, or be the person that isn't trying to be the dream killer or create issues?
Right.
How do you make that balance?
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is really creating a relationship where everybody always feels safe saying what they need to say. And that is, first of all, that's a pipe dream, right? When I say always feel safe, that's never going to happen. But if you create a foundation in your relationship where there's always space for communication, it's easier to have those kind of conversations. So then the question is, how do you do that, right? How do you do that? First of all, you have to have honesty and transparency in your relationship. You just do from the beginning. Now, if you didn't have that from the beginning, it can still get created. Mm-hmm. One really great exercise to do is this thing, and we do this in our family. My husband and I will do it with each other about once a year. We've found is enough, and we'll do it with the kids from time to time as well, is we have these conversations called our amnesty talks. And basically, we say, okay, we're going to have our amnesty talk. And during this time, whatever, if it's 30 minutes or an hour or whatever much time we've set aside, I can tell you anything. And you promise that you're not going to be angry, hold a grudge, get revenge. You can't divorce me over it, right? Like whatever I have to say. Now, that doesn't mean that you might not have a reaction, right? So if I came home and told my husband, oh yeah, by the way, I took out a $50,000 line of credit as part of that amnesty conversation, he's going to have a reaction. He's going to feel upset, betrayed, whatever those emotions are for him. But the agreement then is that we work it out in that conversation so that when that time period is up, we move on with nothing left unsaid between each other. it's a really useful conversation to have, even if you don't feel like there's anything big that you need to divulge. Just having those every now and then. I had this thing I used to do, and I think it was from growing up in poverty, right? And then when I got married the first time, there was quite a bit of money available in my life for the first time, but I felt guilty about spending it. So oftentimes I would do something. I'd go buy clothes for the kids, and I'd spend, say, $100, and I'd come home and my husband would be like, "Oh, that's really cool." And I would say, "Yeah, and I only spent $75 on it." And it was just like, in a way, like these little white lies, right? It's not like I was spending $10,000 and not telling him, but I would always just downplay the cost a little bit. And I don't even know why specifically I felt like that was necessary, but I would do it. And I did it for years until I finally realized I was doing it. So in those amnesty conversations, that was one of the first things that would come out. It doesn't anymore, because it's something I've moved past, but that was one of the things that I would say. I would say, "Yeah, remember I told you I spent, $200 on the new such and such. It was actually $3." And, my husband wasn't upset by that. He wasn't angry about it, but I had it feel, there's that weight of that for me that I was able to let go of. So having those conversations, really important. And the great thing about them is, if you can do it once and really keep the promise of, I won't be angry, I'm not going to get revenge, I'm not going to punish you for it, mentally or in any other way. If you can really keep that, it becomes more and more freeing to have those conversations. And things can come out that you thought, "Oh, I'm never going to tell that one." Right. And eventually you get to a point where there's just nothing between you, because that everything can be said, and it doesn't have to wait for that amnesty conversation. It can be said when it needs to be said.
No, I think that's interesting. Good advice. I think that's certainly something that I'll have to implement, because, and it's not that we hide much, or we're pretty open, but it's just, there's always a bit of that. If you did something, there's a fear of repercussion, or fear that they're going to get mad, and it could be something stupid or trivial that they're really not going to even care about, but
right.
You make it a bigger deal in their mind. Or it could be something big, but then you're scared that you don't want to disappoint them or let them down, or you want to hide it. So I think that's good. So, okay, now I'm going to switch gears to another question, and we could dive onto these questions for much deeper. So one question I think we talked about just a little bit before the podcast was, so you get a fairly wide spectrum of spouses that, on either side, whether it's the man or the woman, whoever's in the startup, of the other spouse wanting to be involved or not wanting to be involved, right?
Yes.
So I'll kind of give you the two extremes that I know of. One is myself, and that's me and my wife, and is that she doesn't have, and I don't fault her, and I'm absolutely respectful and supportive of it. She doesn't have any desire to be an entrepreneur or to be in a startup, right? She just, she works right now. She's a stay-at-home mom, has 4 kids, keep her plenty busy. Before that, she liked working. She was a nurse. She worked for 9 to 5, and she liked the go to work, be able to do your job, come home. You don't have to worry about anything else, and you can just have that time that you work and the time that you don't. I like to keep it separate. So she doesn't have much of an entrepreneur body or bone in her body, but she's a great mom and a good worker. On the other hand, I'm just the opposite of, I'm always thinking of my next startup, my next CEO, I want to do my next project. And so we've had to, kind of, not that we keep it separate, but, she's supportive, she listens, she is there, but I don't involve her. I don't say, "Hey, why don't you come work for my startup?" or "Why don't you be an employee?" or "You want to come do some work?" because she doesn't want to. And I try and be respectful of that. And then on the other extreme, I know I've on a different podcast episode, we had somebody that come on that they were on their 3rd or 4th startup that they've done as a couple together. And kudos to them, because I think we would end up fighting and kill each other. But, they've done it where they enjoyed it and they loved it and they worked together and they worked well. But how do you gauge, if you're getting into a startup or small business or just starting out, how do you figure out, what level of involvement your spouse is, and to keep her involved to that level so that she still feels involved, but you're not asking her to come in and do work when she doesn't want to, or not shutting her out when she wants to be involved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you start by asking, right? Just asking that question: how involved do you want to be? Do you want to be involved at all? Is this something that you're interested in, right? And then I think from there, depending on what the answer is, you're always going to have to adjust. So even if they say, like you just said, your wife just really isn't interested, she wants you to go do it, and she's going to do her thing, and then you'll get together when you get together and have fun with the kids, right? And I think that's, sometimes that is the reality. Sometimes the spouse does not want anything to do with it. But here's an interesting thing, like from a contextual way to relate to it. So my husband and I each have our own business. He's a contractor and I have my private practice. And in very practical ways, we are not involved at all in each other's businesses, right? He doesn't see my clients. He doesn't do my bookkeeping. I don't come frame walls for him, right? We're not really involved. And we, a couple years ago, we had a conversation and we shifted how we talk about our businesses, which is that we have two businesses instead of I have mine and he has his. So even though it didn't change anything about the way we run our businesses or the level at which we were involved, it gave us a sense of ownership. So even with, the case in your marriage, if your wife is out there saying, oh yeah, my husband has all these businesses, that's different than her saying, yeah, well, we have these many businesses and we have this and this and this. How do you get there? Well, again, that's just a conversation too, right? To say, hey, I want this to be an us conversations instead of a me and you conversation, and really see where is the buy-in in it. And then I think also, even if you do have a spouse who really says they don't want to be involved, I think there's always, and it's part of getting that buy-in, there's always little things where a spouse can be involved. So, for me, when I started looking at offices to open my private practice, I asked my husband to come with me. And I asked him to come with me, first of all, because I wanted him to have that buy-in, right? It was an opportunity for us to spend a few hours together for a couple of days, over a couple of weeks, as we were looking at spaces. But also because he is a contractor. So he could look at the spaces and say, and I could say, would we be able to put a wall there? And he could say, oh yeah, that'd be easy. Or no, but if you put it over here, that might work. Or you can't take that one down. Or I noticed the lights are flickering, right? Like he's going to have all of that contractor side of things. And, likewise with his business, he was never really good at the bookkeeping side of things. And so I've been able to, because I have been running businesses for over 20 years myself, I was able to teach him a few things that made that side easier for him. And so I think even with a spouse who really doesn't want to be involved at all, at least that's what they say, if you have little bitty things like, hey, we're repainting the office and you're really good with design. What do you think about this color? You've just suddenly given your spouse an opportunity to have a tiny bit of ownership in what you're doing. And while it might not seem like much and it might not seem significant, it does give them a little buy-in, because then if they stop by the office, they're like, oh, look how pretty this color is that I picked up, right? And just give them
I think that's interesting. Oh, go ahead. And I think that's interesting. And I say my spouse doesn't want to be involved at all. I think to some degree you're going to talk about what you're passionate and love and enjoy, so she gets to hear about it whether she wants to or not.
Absolutely.
Because, hey, if I have a crappy day at work and I say, I was having this issue with this, and I'm making it up this issue with this employee, or this customer didn't do this or whatever, you have to have to vent to someone and they get to hear about, or excitement, this went well. But even that, the other day we do a weekly newsletter, and part of the podcast, and I go out on that. I said, I really don't like the logo that you use for the podcast. And, it's just that little thing. He's like, have you ever thought about changing it? And then I thought about it. I'm like, yeah, I've thought about changing it. And we talked about it and got her input. And, now we're coming out with a new logo. And we just launched a new logo. So, but I think it was even that little thing of, hey, she gave a little bit of a thought and input. And I think to your point, of whether or not it mattered a great deal of whether or not we change the logo, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, we'll see. But I think it was one where it was her little way of being involved, giving the input, made it feel like, she was involved with the company, is heard. And now the next time the newsletter goes out and she sees it, she's, oh yeah, you made that change, and is heard in that. So I like the idea of at least finding different, if nothing else, little ways or ways to be or keep them involved. And certainly if they're working with you and they're involved on a day-to-day basis, that's a different conversation. But I think at least, figuring out what they can contribute or how they can be involved and be heard. And I think that's a great way to strengthen the marriage around the business, even if they don't want to be actively involved with the business.
Yeah. Well, and I think, when you then look at the other extreme, like you said, you had a couple on who had done these startups together, right? And my husband and I have had times where we really were working together on projects, business projects. Obviously we work together at home too, right? But actually working on business projects together. And, one important thing is learning how your partner works. One of the things we discovered was, we had an issue. We had built this ramp for accessibility on a building, and the city came over and said, well, you have to do this and this and this. And they hadn't told us that the first time, right? Because that's how that goes. Then they came over and added a bunch of stuff. And really with what we'd already done, it was looking almost impossible. So my way of handling that is I jump right in and go, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? My husband's way of handling that is, let me complain about it for about 20 minutes until I've said all these nasty things that I need to say, and then I'm going to solve the problem. And as you can imagine, when we started to, when we were first doing that and not realizing that was the dynamic, we would run into conflict because, in that particular case, I said, well, what if we, whatever my suggestion was at the time, and his response was, we can't do that because blah, 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 right? Because he hadn't had his time to say the nasty stuff yet. And once we saw that dynamic, we were actually in couples therapy at the time because we were having such a struggle working together, and we had about 4 months. So it was going to be all day, every day. And so from, after about 2 weeks in, I was like, we're going to need some support here. So as soon as we saw that dynamic, the next time we had an issue, I just stopped talking, let him do his thing and run through it all. And as soon as it was clear that he was starting to problem solve, then I was able to say, okay, here's my idea, until we came up with something that worked. So, learning those ways that each person works and problem solves and comes up with ideas and expresses ideas. And, you can only usually learn those things through trial and error, right? Something happens, it doesn't go well. But then taking the time to process it together with or without support, depending on what's needed, is really important so that, the next time you have a problem, you can move through it more smoothly, knowing what the other person needs.
Yeah, almost a post-mortem on why that didn't work and what we can do and figure out what makes sense. So
exactly.
Well, we're running towards the end of the podcast, trying to keep it about 30 minutes, and there's about 20 more fun things I'm sure that people would want to talk about or hear and everything else. And we'll have to have you back on another time and chat more on keeping marriage strong. But as we wrap up, what is, if people are wanting to get a hold of you, wanting to get involved, whether it's, they have, and I always, maybe it's just me. I always had the connotation, if you go into a therapist, it means that your marriage is broken and you want to fix it, and that kind of thing. But I also think there's a place that, hey, let's keep a marriage strong, or avoid the issues and keep it up front, or make it our marriage even better in that. And whatever bucket they lie in, if they're wanting to get into startup and saying, hey, how can I avoid the pitfalls that others make, or saying, hey, startup is putting a lot of strain on our marriage, how do we get this back on track? What's the best way to get to reach out to you, to get involved and get engaged with you?
Absolutely. So my business is Third Eye Family Solutions. That's THIRDEYE, as in your third eye and a third set of eyes in your relationship. And so thirdeyefamilysolutions.com is our website. There's a button on there where you can click and get a free consultation with me. It's like up to 30 minutes. And we just discuss what's going on and see if it's something that we can support you with. I do have another therapist who works with me, and we work in different ways. So I'm able through those consultations to see and say, oh yeah, definitely work with me, or no, you should go work with Jamie. So that's the easiest way. And I also have a podcast myself. It's called Some of the Answers, and it's available on all the typical podcast platforms. I haven't talked specifically about businesses or startups, but we do talk a lot about relationships and how to create extraordinary relationships, and a lot about families and parenting as well. So those are the easiest ways. Or you can also just email me at thirdeyefamilysolutions@gmail.com, and we can talk that way too.
All right. Well, for all those listeners that are wanting to get their marriage back on track, fix their marriage, get it strengthened, or even make it better, or wanting to get the pitfalls and the advice before you jump in to a startup, certainly invite them to go to the website, shoot you an email, and listen to your podcast. Thanks again for coming on. It was fun to talk through. It was some great advice, and hopefully that everybody that's in the startup realm and wanting to already in the trenches or wanting to get in the trenches have learned some great things. As always, for those of you that are wanting to come on and tell your inventive journey, you're welcome to go to apply at inventivejourneyguest.com. And for those of you that listeners, make sure to subscribe so that you can hear all the new episodes, including this one. And if you need any help with patents and trademarks, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to help. Thanks again for coming on. It was a pleasure and fun to talk through, and good luck helping everybody to continue to have strong marriages.
Great. Thank you, Devin.